Good evening, everybody. Good evening, Your Excellency. Good evening, Madam Director. Good evening, Vice President. Good evening, moderators. And good evening, my lovely dear colleagues. Thank you so very much for joining us here today. My name is Altamash Khalil. I'm the president of the International Law Student Association, the Hague chapter, and it is my distinct honor to be able to represent the organization amid all of you, in particular, His Excellency. International Law Student Association aims to foster the development of international law. The Hague chapter strives to do the same through its various committees. Last year, the old board introduced ILSA Ambassadors, a project. ILSA Ambassadors is a project where ILSA members got to represent the association, and within the project, we developed something called as ILSA Diplomacy Days, where we had diplomats, ambassadors of various countries to the Netherlands come and give a talk about diplomacy to all our students. Today is no different. First off, I'd like to invite the moderators of the day, Daniel and Milena. Thank you so very much for taking on the responsibility.
Thank you, Altamash. My name is Daniel Neave-Maass. I'm an international and European law student here at the Hague University of Applied Sciences. And it's my pleasure to be your moderator, one of your moderators for today.
And hello, everyone. My name is Milena Drăghici. I am 21 years old. I am Romanian, and I'm a third-year student in the International and European Law program. And I'm so happy to see so many people here and also online, so I welcome you all. And I'm going to give the floor back to Altamash. Thank you. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Given the precarity of the situation, it is so wonderful to be able to organize an event in person. And this would not have been possible without our law program and our dear technician, Vincent, here today. So thank you so very much. And before I leave, I'd like to kindly invite our program director, Ms. Claire Moore, to come up here and give an introduction about His Excellency. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody, also the people here in the audience, and of course, everybody who's joining us online, either here in the Netherlands, but also all the students who are still around the world. I have heard, and of course you all know this is my first year as a director, but what I've already seen is that ILSA is really ambitious and wants to do some fantastic things for you guys as students. So for the first years out there, do make sure you also, when the time comes, volunteer, get involved, because you will see that you can really make a difference. This is the first Diplomacy Day of this year. And also, of course, the first one that we can have live since COVID. So this is really a fantastic event. And we are very, very happy that His Excellency Matthew Neuhaus, I need the German version, we just found out, is here to speak to you all. He has a very varied background, and I think as the country of the Netherlands, we can be very happy that somebody with a dual role of not only being the ambassador to this fantastic country, but it's also the head of the Middle East and African Development for Foreign Affairs and Trade. And that means he has a lot of contacts, not just here in the Netherlands, but throughout the world, and definitely also throughout Africa. And when you read his bio, you can see that he is also being an ambassador in many African countries. And that makes it a very special place that he's been able to be here. He was appointed in August 2018. And yeah, we've had a lot of pleasure, and I think the Netherlands and Australia has a lot of work that they do together, a lot of trade that they do together. So I would like to invite you, Your Excellency, to come and talk to the students and share your knowledge.
Do you want me to speak from here or here initially?
Whichever you're most comfortable.
Okay. Perhaps I'll speak from here first, and then we'll do the question and answers from there, because perhaps it's easier for people to see me. Well, first of all, let me say thank you very much for what a wonderful, wonderful welcome. And I hope you'll sit down while I'm speaking as well, so you don't have to stand for a very long time. It's a great pleasure as Australian Ambassador to be here, and one thing that my bio actually skipped in that short thing is I am an international lawyer, and that is why it's a great pleasure to be in The Hague. And in fact, it was good that we could do this week, because last week I was very busy with the Assembly of the International Criminal Court, the Assembly of States Parties, and the week before with the Conference of States Parties of the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. So I got a break, and my break is to come here. And what a wonderful evening, what a great audience. I was surprised, you know, in these COVID days, as your director said, it's great to do some live events again. And at the same time, I'm glad we're online and look forward to engaging that way. Now, as an ambassador, you should always be promoting your country. That's the first thing. So I brought along something, and it's going to be a present for ILSA. I guess you can all see the kangaroo there in the bag. And there are a couple of other things I want to draw attention to in the bag, which I'll be leaving a few things there. But one is, I've got to open this bag. Where is it? Is Australia in brief. So you can all, those of you who get to look at it, can learn a little bit more about Australia. There are things like a map of Australia and all of that in it. But the other thing, as an ambassador, you're always keen to strengthen the relationship between the country to which you're an ambassador and, oops, I'm dropping a few things. And build up what we call the bilateral relations. And here in Dutch, for those of you, because I think most of you are actually English speakers, but here in Dutch is a magazine we produced a few years ago called Boomerang, and it was celebrating the 400th anniversary of Dirk Hartog, a famous Dutch explorer who first went to Western Australia and left a very famous plate behind, which you can now see in the Rijksmuseum, actually. And it just underlines the history. In it are all sorts of exciting articles about the history, but one that's of particular interest to students somewhere in here, can't quite see it just yet, I'm still looking for it, is, yes, here it is, but you probably can't see it at home, but is an article on the solar car challenge. Now, it wasn't this university that was involved in that, but it's a great thing between Dutch universities and Australian outback. And of course, they've been developing originally, this is what solar cars looked like, but they're getting smaller and smaller. In fact, I was up in Groningen a few months ago looking at the latest prototype in solar cars, and they really are coming along extremely well. And I know you're very interested, all of you, your generation, in the environment, and so you should be, because we do need to do more for our planet. Now, I promised just to say a few words before we sit down for what is essentially an interactive question and answer session. And the points that I really wanted to make, diplomats are always very good at making 3 points. It's something you learn because it's quite good when you go into a meeting because people might remember 3 points. They won't remember anything more than that. They may only remember 1 point. And the 3 points I wanted to quickly address was, the question I most get is, how did you become an ambassador? So I'll give you a quick answer to that. The second one is, where did you serve? And the third one is often, well, why The Hague? Why have you come here? And I think they're all very good questions to ask, and it puts you on the spot. Well, the first question is, well, how did you become an ambassador? Well, first of all, you have to become a diplomat. And to become a diplomat, because you don't become an ambassador, unless you're a senior politician perhaps, without doing a fair bit of work as a diplomat first. And to become a diplomat, you start where you are starting. You start with studying the sorts of subjects that are valuable. And law is one of them. International law is very valuable. And you are lucky to be in The Hague, the center of international law. a city I first visited as a postgraduate student at Cambridge University in the UK for a moot or a mock court case, which you must all know about, at the International Court of Justice. So you start here. And you also start not just by studying your subject, and you can do a range of subjects. I mean, when you think of the environment nowadays, and we're doing a lot of negotiations around climate change, it's quite useful to have a scientific background. Economics is good. Languages are important. But international law, which to this audience I say, is very useful. And you usually have to do a postgraduate course because there's so much competition for these positions in every nation's system. And then eventually you will get chosen, and then you go on your first posting. And that's where you really discover whether you're going to be good at your job or not, because the most important thing is that you are ready to engage with other cultures. You have to have the sort of attitude that makes you very open to other cultures. You obviously are representing your country, so you need to know your country well, or if you move into the United Nations, you need to have that sense of international community so you can represent the values of an international community. But you also have to be able to do what is called intercultural engagement very easily. If you're uncomfortable in other cultures, don't become a diplomat. So you're in a fantastic starting point here because you are actually living in an environment of other cultures. And I found that particularly when I studied at Cambridge University all those years ago, and we had students coming from all over the world, more so than Australia, even though we are a multicultural country. So you're at a good starting point. Then becoming an ambassador takes a long time because you are tested. You are tested in tough posts, you are tested in multilateral posts, you are tested in working for your minister or your prime minister sometimes, and you learn whether you're good at sort of, if you like, playing the political game. Are you able to, you know, sort of manage, do diplomacy at home, move, you know, with parties, but keep your integrity, because political parties will come and go, ministers will come and go, but you will always be able, I hope, to represent your nation's interests. And generally only about, in most systems, perhaps 1 in 10, 1 in 20 people end up as an ambassador. And so you may get there. I was fairly lucky because I was only 39 when I was first an ambassador. So I've been an ambassador, but also working for international organizations in those 20 years. And I'm now coming to the end of my time. And I do hope when I finish up next year, end of next year, to go back to Australia and engage more with universities, because I think universities are so important for the future. We can, in the question and answer session, come back more to that. Then the other question is, where did you serve? Well, I've served, and because it will help in the question and answers, in a wide range of places. So I start with a history honours degree, and I did my first thesis on actually Australia's policy towards the emergence of Indonesia in the 1940s, when it was still the Netherlands East Indies, and it was post the Second World War, nationalist movement, and we had to make a choice about the future. And so ironically here, my last posting as ambassador is here, back in the Netherlands, but way back when I did it in the early 80s in Australia, that thesis has proved to be very valuable, because still the debates are around happening here around that period of history. Then I did my international law studies, and also at Sydney University. And as I say, I also then had a year at Cambridge doing an MPhil in international relations, where I did a thesis on the negotiation of Zimbabwe's independence, which was later to be very valuable to me. And in particular, the role of an international organization called the Commonwealth, which is based in the UK, and like La Francophonie is for French-speaking countries, for English-speaking countries, is an international organization that brings it together. And I also studied more international law. And so then I went on my first posting to Nairobi, Africa. I'd spent some of my childhood in Africa, so that was great to be in a familiar environment, speaking a language, Swahili, which I understood. Then I went to a neighboring country, always important to serve in your neighbors. So Papua New Guinea, which is a developing country very close to Australia, and where we were once the administering power, and indeed for a period too under a United Nations trusteeship. And then they were quite keen in the department that I should continue working on Pacific matters, but I said, no, I really want to get back to working on international law. That's my real interest. So I was fortunate to be moved into the International Law Division and then to be appointed legal advisor to our delegation to the United Nations in New York. So that was a fantastic period. It was the 1990s. There was the negative side of it, of course. There were the Balkans Wars, Somalia. There was all these crises, but the positive side was that it was the end of the Cold War, and we had opportunities to do a lot of different negotiations. I was involved in the Cambodia peace process. I was involved in early negotiations on the Chemical Weapons Convention that set up the OPCW. I was involved in the early stages of the International Criminal Court negotiations, and more specifically the Rome Statute. But of course, it's a career of variety, and then I was promoted there, but told you have to come back and be Director of Staffing Policy, which was the only job I really disliked in my career, because you seem to be always dealing with the problems that people have in human resources in a department. But luckily I escaped from that and was made UN Director, and then from being UN Director was made Ambassador in Nigeria at a fairly early stage, because actually it wasn't a very popular posting, because it was a pretty tough country to work in. It was a military dictatorship there, and I was lucky to be there at a time when we went through a democratic transition. And so we are now right into 1999 and then year 2000. So I went back to Australia, and then I worked for the Prime Minister's Department for a period, and we were organising the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, and that was a very interesting occasion, but that led to me being recruited out of the Australian Foreign Service to be political director of the Commonwealth Secretariat in London, where I stayed for over 6 years and was very involved in a lot of peace negotiations in Commonwealth countries, particularly Africa, Pacific and so forth, where there was a lot of conflict. I used to say my main job was to try and fix up the messes left by the British Empire. And there's quite a lot of work to do there. But there came a period, you know, in international organizations, it's the same here at places like the OPCW, there's often a set time limit when you can work for them. I did what was effectively 2 terms. So I had to then decide, and here I was, I'm now 50, whether I moved into a completely different area of work or whether I still like diplomacy. And I decided I liked diplomacy, and I went back to my national service. And very fortunately for me, after a year working on the Pacific, we were chairing the Pacific Islands Forum. I was appointed ambassador in Zimbabwe, which was a country I'd worked on a lot, obviously earlier academically, but in the Commonwealth Secretariat, where because of President Mugabe's behavior, they had been suspended from the Commonwealth. And that allowed me to continue that sort of work. I presented my credentials to President Mugabe, and I can tell you many stories about that whole process. And it's Zimbabwe is still seeking its way back into the community of democratic nations, but I'm very confident in what its people will do. Then I returned to Australia, and as has been mentioned, I really want to get back to international law. I was thinking I've been distracted by all these other things along the way, and they said, no, we still need you working on Africa, to run the Africa branch, and then ultimately the Middle East and Africa division. I have to say, though, when I was appointed here, I did have to give up the work on the Middle East and Africa division. I don't do that anymore, because you cannot be the ambassador in The Hague and still run the Middle East and Africa division. It's a big job, a lot of travel, a lot of crises, and a lot of interest. And I actually came here on one occasion to Amsterdam, in fact, for a meeting of the counter-ISIL coalition. And I think one of the greatest things that was achieved during that time was the defeat of ISIL in Iraq. And I've been to some meetings here on Iraq where they are making progress in Iraq, and I hope it will be sustained. But I really wanted to get back to international law, and I was saying to the minister and the secretary, you know, the best place I felt would be The Hague. And luckily I was still thought of right back to those UN days as an international lawyer, and I'd been involved in doing some legal work on the side for the department. So I was very fortunate to be appointed to The Hague, which for me was sort of the ultimate post, the capital of international law. And of course, to be made permanent representative to the OPCW and to be involved with the ICC and all these things. So it's been a great posting despite COVID, and I've been very fortunate in my career. Finally, and I've half answered that already, so where did I serve? But then why The Hague? And that's what we come to, why The Hague? Because The Hague is really one of the best places in the world, not just to study international law, but as a multilateral center where there are so many international organizations come together, ably supported by the Dutch government. And it's not in any sense that this is by chance. It may have been by chance all those years ago that the peace conference was held here at the end of the 1800s, which led to the establishment of the Permanent Court of Arbitration and the building of the Peace Palace. Of course, sadly, it was a failed attempt because it was built in 1913, and I'm fortunate enough to live in a very nice house that was built at the same time, just near the Peace Palace. But the 1914, as we all know, was the beginning of the First World War. People could see the problem coming. They started to develop the solutions. It didn't work. But over the last century, these efforts have persisted. And gradually, we have made progress, I believe, through the League of Nations came, it didn't work. We had the Second World War. The United Nations, for all its faults, has been a much more effective international institution. When you look at something like the International Court of Justice compared to its predecessor, it too, I think, is working much more effectively. And I think we are learning more and more to work multilaterally. So while we can be overwhelmed by the tensions of the day, the tensions with Russia on the Ukraine border at the moment, the tensions with China in the Indo-Pacific area, I believe that we have made progress. And I think the European Union is one of the best examples of the progress we have made. It was a very chilling reminder to me as a young diplomat in New York in the 1990s when the former Yugoslavia fell apart. And we were then in the middle of the Balkans War. And for several years that preoccupied us. I was reporting back to Australia. We have very big communities from that part of the world in Australia on what was happening in the Security Council and the negotiations around that. And without the European Union, we would not have stabilized the situation. And without the European Union, we would not have got to where we are. Let me say to some of you, because you come from countries which, and you are too young to remember the Cold War, unlike me. So I still find it extraordinary to look around the room and see the Bulgarian ambassador at the OPCW, one of our strongest friends. I remember when Bulgaria was a total client of the Soviet Union, and you just would never look to Bulgaria for support. And so on it goes. And when I see the work we do, the cooperation that's built, I still have a great deal of optimism for the future. And I would emphasize the importance of international law and the continuing importance of diplomats. So with that as my presentation, I will come over to the seat and then we can talk a little bit more about what might interest you. Thank you all very much.
So we would like to thank you again for this amazing introduction. I think we got a lot of insight into your personal work, and I think we have more to learn from you today. So just quickly for our attendees, we are firstly gonna engage in a discussion with His Excellency, and afterwards we are gonna open the floor to you, so you can ask His Excellency any questions that you might have. So thank you so much, and
Yes, thank you, Your Excellency, for that introduction. And I must say, what an incredible journey you've had to be with us here today. And thank you again for accepting our invitation. It's a privilege and honor to be here. And now for the first questions, we'd like to look more into your role as an ambassador and diplomat. So firstly, as you mentioned, the Netherlands, The Hague specifically, is a host of many international organizations and tribunals. How does this unique setting change the role or change your approaches to the role of a diplomat or ambassador compared with your previous experiences?
Well, one of the unique things about the Hague is that it's both a bilateral and a multilateral post. As international lawyers, we all love the multilateral posts, and it sort of goes with what we're interested in, because we are interested in international law and the way in which international organizations work and the way in which you use language to achieve outcomes, like we were doing just last week at the International Criminal Court Assembly, passing resolutions on reform of the ICC and processes at the OPCW, getting agreement in the face of Russian and Chinese opposition to, but passing with great support and understanding on central nervous system acting chemicals, that they are not appropriate for law enforcement purposes. And so as a multilateralist, I love that. But as a bilateralist, and most of my posts have been bilateral, and most posts are bilateral, it's about a bilateral relationship between one country and another, improving the people-to-people ties, the commercial ties, cultural ties, and indeed the security dialogue. And we have all of that with the Netherlands. Few people know that the Netherlands is the fourth largest investor into Australia. So only the US, the UK, and Japan are greater. It is even greater than China, even though China is still a major trading partner for us. And many countries have a lot of Netherlands investment, but it was a surprise to me when I took up this job. So that means there's a real depth also to our business relationship. And even in my time here, it has grown, partly because of Brexit. Commonwealth Bank, which had long had a headquarters in London, has kept a headquarters in London, has opened its other European headquarters here in the Netherlands. It's our biggest bank. Macquarie Bank, another one there. On the other side, ING, Rabobank have opened up in Australia in recent years, and Rabobank has now become our biggest rural bank, the biggest bank providing services to our country areas in Australia, which I find, we used to have a rural bank, but it has disappeared, and Rabobank has moved into that space. So that just underlines that side of things, which is really very important to the prosperity of both countries. And every bilateral ambassador has that as very top of their agenda. But also with the Netherlands, we have, the common cause over MH17 after that terrible tragedy, and I spend quite a lot of time on that. The trial is ongoing here in the Netherlands. Very important to the families of the victims and very important for truth, justice, and accountability. And then, of course, pre-COVID, we used to have so many cultural ties, and that's one of the fun things about being ambassador, going to opening nights. I mean, even with COVID, the other day I was delighted to go to a ballet Mata Hari, which was in Amsterdam, with an Australian as its the main, you can't call him the prima ballerina because it's the prima man ballet dancer in it, but so it's just that variety. So there are very few posts like this. I mean, when you're in New York or Geneva, you're just always on multilateral, and in most posts you're always on just the bilateral, with maybe a few conferences come along from time to time. But here, it's a really terrific post from that point of view.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. It's very interesting to see that besides having a bilateral aspect, there's also multi-level aspects, and I think The Hague also is very helping that a lot. So I would like now to move towards Australia's international relations, and as your honourable guest said that also you worked in as being the Australian ambassador in Zimbabwe and also being the Middle East and Africa division head of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So with that in mind, our question would be, how could you describe the relationship between Australia and Africa, knowing that you have such great experience?
Right. Well, it's a very interesting one. First of all, I have to say, and my former minister, Julie Bishop, used to like to keep saying this too, is Africa is 53 countries. So when you're talking about Africa, just let's say Africa, let's not even be talking about the Middle East, which is another sort of 20 odd countries. But just in Africa, you've got all those bilateral relationships. There's a lot of bilateral relationships. That said, there are some common issues on development, in particular for Africa, because all African countries are still developing countries. Poverty is still a major issue, modernization a major issue. Now, for Australia, it's particularly unusual because we are in the Indo-Pacific. And that means our focus, like every country has to have, is on their immediate neighborhood. So that's Asian countries near us and Pacific countries. And both of those are quite different. Asian countries are large, big populations, expanding economies. Pacific are very small, very vulnerable. And in many cases, their economies are heavily dependent on what we call remittances. And we have to, in those, particularly those developing Pacific countries, provide a lot of support. So that means we do not have much in the way of development assistance to put into Africa, which European countries and the United States does. So our relationship with African countries is primarily driven by commerce, which in fact most African countries prefer. And in our particular case, we are a famous mining country. Everyone's heard about mining in Australia. In fact, despite the tensions we have with the Chinese, we have to thank the Chinese for keeping our economy going during COVID, because they're buying our iron ore all that time. So that means enormous remittances coming into Australia through that. So it's some of the ironies. But in addition to our Australian resources, our mining companies have done a lot in Africa developing mining. And in my role, first as ambassador in Zimbabwe and later heading up the division which covered Africa, indeed, I traveled a lot to visit these mines to make sure that they were being run properly in accordance with best practice, which I'm pleased to say I believe was the case. And we used to actually twice a year have major mining conferences, one in Australia and one in Africa. And we had this big program too called Africa Awards to enhance the capacity of African countries to manage their own resources and to develop the expertise that was needed there. So that just gives you some example of how it fitted into our broader focus as well on the Indo-Pacific relationship.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Your Excellency. If I understood, Australia has a very unique sort of position and relationship with several other countries, and you mentioned the EU in your answer there. Could you elaborate more on Australia's relationship with the EU and specifically the Netherlands?
Yeah, well, thank you. And of course, that's an important part of my role here. And in a way, you could say that in addition to bilateral and multilateral, the European Union engagement is a third element to this. And I'm pleased to say the Netherlands has been one of our strongest supporters as we want to build our relationship with the European Union. And crucial to that at the moment is the negotiation of a free trade agreement with the European Union, our EU FTA. Now, these things take a lot of time. I had a bet with the former Prime Minister of Australia when I came here that during my period here, we would manage to negotiate the FTA. He said, you won't. And we bet a bottle of wine on it, and I'm afraid he's won that bet, because not only have we not got there yet, there are all sorts of complications, and I think we're still some years away from it, because first of all, there's an issue over things like geographical indicators. Some of you who specialize in this will get to know this well. But, you know, we have lots of Greek farmers in Australia who are producing feta cheese, but you can't use feta cheese if you have a free trade agreement. We had given up some time ago calling our sparkling wine champagne in order to get into a wine agreement, which has worked very well for us, because then we could sell a lot more wine into the European Union. But there is still a lot of geographical indicators, including cheese, because, for example, even here sitting in the Netherlands, where you have Edam cheese and Gouda cheese, or we call it Gouda. But even if we call it Gouda, doesn't matter. If we were into a free trade agreement with the European Union, they'll probably say, well, it can only apply to that cheese from that place. So these are some of the very specific things that become a problem. But there are much bigger issues too, around standards, climate issues now increasingly, and so on and so forth. So negotiating, that's going to take a lot of time. But another element about the European Union engagement is around values. And one thing we've been pursuing strongly with the European Union is that we want them more engaged in the Indo-Pacific. And there are indeed some countries, like the Netherlands, like France, that have long and historic ties with the Indo-Pacific region, but we want them there more because of the values, because I think we share the same democratic values, and these values are under challenge in the world, and particularly from two great powers who do not need to remain nameless, because we will name them constantly. But they don't yet share our values. I hope that one day they will. But it is very important, and it's very important for us sitting in this room to be very committed to these values, because we know that they are the values that will really allow people to achieve the best for themselves. And those of you who have come from countries that once were seen as part of East Europe but are now part of the European Union will, perhaps not in your generation because you're too young, but when you talk to your parents, will hear a lot more about the challenges that they faced. And I used to see this when I was a student, that I would meet students from these countries, and you could see that those countries were going to change because of the energy that was there to have the same values. And I've seen that a lot in Africa as well, where there is a great desire for people for democracy. When I was a much younger man, people say, oh, democracy, multi-parties, that's not the African way. Just like they used to say in certain parts of Europe, but in fact it's just a common human need, that we want freedom. We want a freedom to express ourselves, to build ourselves economically. And so we need to keep real sense of commitment to those values, because they will be the values that will win out in the end, even as they are challenged and still remain under challenge at present.
Thank you so much. It's great to hear that negotiations are still going between Australia and the European Union, and I think everyone hopes that they will remain on good terms. I would want to remain on the value aspect, and as we all know, Australia is a founding member of the UN and has been an active participant. With that in mind, how would you describe Australia's values and contribution to the formulation of international law?
Well, thank you for that, and you're absolutely right. And our foreign minister of the time, 1945, H.V. Evatt, was a very committed internationalist. He was also, incidentally, a lawyer. Are you surprised? And at the time was the youngest judge of the High Court, and then had stepped down from the High Court to enter politics and then become foreign minister. And I studied him quite a lot. By all accounts, he wasn't an easy person to work for, but he was an idealist and very committed and very effective. And Australia was very active in the establishment of the United Nations. And in fact, we had one of the first challenges we faced with those values was indeed over the whole issue of Indonesia and the Netherlands, because the Netherlands was a country that, of course, is committed to democracy and freedom, and perhaps one of the most democratic countries in the world with its polder system, but it had been impoverished. It had been through a very bad Second World War of occupation, and it wanted to, regain the Netherlands East Indies right on the Australia's border, and for 5 years tried to do so, and discovered that there was a nationalist movement there that was not ready to give back control. And so Australia then had to try and help that negotiation process. And the only way we managed to get success was through the United Nations, so that a range of countries were then involved in that process. And let me say that the country had been brutalized by the Japanese during the Second World War, and the nationalist movement had been very much infiltrated by it as well. So there was there were really bad things on both sides. And as I say, I've studied this extensively. But the end result was indeed that the Netherlands accepted an independent Indonesia, and it's great to see the relationship that the Netherlands has with an independent Indonesia over the years, and Australia too has with an independent Indonesia. So that was one of the first tests, independence for developing countries which had previously been colonies. And then Australia had to face it with its own colony in Papua New Guinea, and at the appropriate time, provide independence there as well. So international law played a key element in all of this. Now, later on, I myself was studying, as I've mentioned, the situation in Zimbabwe. And because of the studies I'd done on Indonesia and Zimbabwe, I personally was able to be involved in supporting our government in the early 90s in the Cambodia peace process as an international lawyer, and advising our then Minister, Gareth Evans, on that. It meant some very long nights and weekends lost, but it was very, very worth it. And also another issue I was very involved in was the whole Commonwealth engagement on South Africa. And we forget that apartheid only ended in 1994. It's a relatively recent phenomenon. Many of you, for that seems like a long time ago, but for someone like myself, we have lived through these situations, and I think Australia has made its contribution. I've already mentioned that I was involved here with the negotiation with the Chemical Weapons Convention. As a lawyer, you are very well placed to look back on precedents, to look back on earlier negotiations, look back on languages, which helps for agreement. And then when I was at the Commonwealth as political director, much more involved in negotiations between differing parties in countries as diverse as Guyana, Zanzibar in Tanzania, Maldives and so forth, Solomon Islands, to work through with the different parties agreements which can then bring end to conflict and peace. You always have to keep working at it, but both having a strong sense of values and a sense of law, which is in a way you create contracts, essentially at an international level, which allow agreements to be held, and then people have a space with which they can work with one another, and they have an alternative to real conflict where they're killing one another. And I have been in situations in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Uganda, in Sierra Leone over the years where people have been killing one another. And without these agreements, even genocides happened. I mean, as I mentioned, the Balkans, but when I was at the United Nations in New York, the Rwanda genocide happened. Eventually, peace was able to be established, but the Rwanda tribunal, just like the Sierra Leone tribunal, were very important then to building a more sustained peace. And then if you go to Sierra Leone or Rwanda today, you would hardly believe, that, I remember Sierra Leone being shot at, and I was lucky to be in the armored car of the American ambassador at the time. You would hardly believe that 20 years ago, that's what it was like. And so it gives me, once again, a lot of optimism.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Your Excellency. The world has changed quite a lot in quite a short amount of time. And it's amazing the work that the diplomats and ambassadors like yourself do. keeping on the topic of history, could you give a brief insight into the evolution of diplomacy in Australia and its relationships with other nations?
Well, for Australia, we're pretty young. Our foreign service was really only established in the 1940s. Before that, we essentially left that to Britain. We did become a country in 1900 with the establishment of Australia. But for a very long time, we had only one overseas post, our High Commission in London, which basically liaised with the British, and we were part of the British Empire, so we pretty much left it to the British to run our foreign affairs for us. But when the Second World War came, and we'd begun to move forward a bit before the Second World War, it really hit us. We needed to have an independent place in the world. First of all was the famous occasion with the Japanese invasion into what was then the Netherlands, East Indies, and Malaysia and so forth. After Pearl Harbor, we realized the British could no longer defend us. So that's when we made our Prime Minister made a famous speech appealing to the United States to come to support us. Now, the United States actually needed Australia as well because they had just lost the Philippines, and famously General MacArthur came down to Australia and used Australia then as the base in the Second World War to fight back. But that made us realize that we needed a diplomatic service to engage in our own region with the United Nations, as we want to set that up for the future, and with European nations. And in fact, we entered into diplomatic relations with the Netherlands in 1942. I was just reminded today by a Dutch diplomat that next February will be the 80th anniversary of that. And we entered into it with the government in exile in London, actually. And then once liberation happened here, we came straight over. And of course, many of our Air Force had been fighting for the liberation of the Netherlands. And one of the things I do as ambassador is constantly go around to remembrances where these airmen who died in the war are buried, and it means a lot to the families to go and visit these places and remember them. So alongside that, as Europe was liberated, we entered into diplomatic relations with most European countries. African nations were becoming independent. We entered into diplomatic relations with them. We had a particular priority on Commonwealth countries initially, the former British Empire countries, but alongside Asia and Europe, and then we eventually into Latin America and so forth. And now we pretty much cover the globe and have diplomatic relations with every country, and we have posts in over 100 countries, and of course we have in some countries like India, China, and so forth, consulates as well, and the United States of America.
Yeah, thank you so much for giving us a relationship between Australia and all the diplomatic field it has around the world. I want to remain in the international field, and I would like to tackle right now some challenges, cross-border challenges, and I would like to start with climate change. This autumn happened the COP26, and Australia promised to achieve 35% reduction of emissions by 2030 and zero emissions by 2050. Also knowing that Australia is the fourth largest energy exporter. How does Australia address this type of cross-border challenges? And do you think an international cooperation approach would be essential?
Oh, it's essential. There's no doubt about it. I mean, interesting how, the environment and climate change is such a big issue now. 20 years ago, Rio conference, we were looking at it. It was not something you would build your career around. I mean, honestly. And then it just became more and more serious. We were much more concerned, when I was a somewhat younger official in doing big deals on gas or oil or whatever, and developing our resources, particularly with the new economies like India and China. And of course, frankly, Australia has benefited a lot economically from selling coal and to China and gas to China. I remember one of our former prime ministers, John Howard, when I was working with, so excited when we did the big gas deal with China, and we're into LNG and all of this. Now it's a new world, and we're into sustainable energy. And the thing I would say most about this, because, you know, while you probably look at me as a very old person, I don't feel that old yet.
It's not true.
Thank you. But energy transition is really at a crucial moment. And I say now, funnily enough, ironically, coal is still our largest export to the Netherlands, largely because it's a particular form of coal that they need at the Tata steel mill here and keeps that going. And it actually is, we're having discussions with Tata about how they're going to reduce their emissions. But I say I look forward in the next 10 to 15 years for all that to be replaced by hydrogen, because Australia, having signed on to net zero by 2050, like the rest of the world, actually has one of the highest take-ups of solar energy around the world. And because we have so much access to renewable power, we now have several entrepreneurs, of which one, Andrew Forrest, was visiting here, the Port of Rotterdam, only a few months ago. He really wants to make a very big difference on hydrogen. He has the former Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, chairing his new board of Fortescue Future Industries. And every state in Australia is coming to me talking about the opportunities of the Port of Rotterdam and the German market, and developing hydrogen, you're building great solar farms using our, we've got large dams, and so we've got hydropower from those and other sources of renewable power to produce hydrogen and then concentrate it in such a way that we can bring it to Europe. So this is quite a huge discussion, huge investment going into this, billions and billions of dollars. So while I will admit that Australia has been a bit of a climate laggard for many reasons, although I have to say, if you look at the figures, Australia actually does comparatively well to the Netherlands when it comes to challenging things like nitrogen. Of course, you have a much higher population. We have other challenges. But in fact, the business, people, and governments will catch up, are very committed to energy transition. And I think, you know, one of the big jobs for diplomats at the current time is to work on energy transition. And just before COP, I had a very good discussion with the Dutch ambassador on climate, Jaime de Palma. And I see nuclear energy is back on the table here as well. Mm-hmm. We also produce a lot of uranium, so if you need the uranium for nuclear, come knocking on our door. You know, so I think you'll find Australia, just like it's been a big energy producer, will be a big player into the new energies that we need to address the climate challenge, which towards my end of my career is perhaps one of the greatest challenges we face.
It's true. It's true.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It's great to see that the issues, social issues like climate change, are still being sort of on the cards in discussion and being treated seriously. Remaining on the topic of social issues, as I'm sure you're aware, recently Judge Hilary Charlesworth has been sworn in as a judge of the International Court of Justice. This is no doubt an excellent step towards gender equality in a notoriously male-dominated field. How does Australia address issues like gender equality, and how important is international cooperation in addressing this kind of issue?
Well, thanks for that question, because first of all, it allows me to say to you that Hilary and I are very old friends, going back now. I hesitate to say it, but I have to realize it's some 40 years. And she and I were both recruited to join the Foreign Service at the same time. We both had scholarships to go to the United States. And I have to say, mine was only to go to the University of Hawaii. Hers was to go to Harvard. But the department said to us, you can either join the Foreign Service or you can take your scholarship. Hilary made the choice to go to Harvard and go on to a very distinguished career as an international lawyer, and we've been close friends since. I made the choice to join the Foreign Service and end up here in The Hague. So we both feel we made the right choice. But I can say that I was delighted after the sad death of Professor Judge James Crawford, another good friend, that Hillary was available. And I was also proud that the Australian National Group did nominate Hillary. And interestingly, I go to the legal advisors meeting of the Council of Europe to represent Australia, and I was there in September while she was running. And we had a presentation from Judge Joan Donoghue, the president of the court, and I asked her the question. I said, you know, what can be done about improving gender balance on the court? And she said the big problem is the national groups, that they are not nominating women, even though they have lots of highly qualified women. And even to my surprise during the campaign, there were several countries that would say to me, well, we want to vote for the winning country, but we don't think a woman will win. I have to say I was surprised that that attitude still existed. But it does, and it just does show that there's still some way to go in these matters. But it is important, first of all, that women run. Second of all, that they're nominated, that they have courage to do this, and third of all, that countries support them. And you know, this changes. When I first joined the Foreign Service, there was quite a gender imbalance. About 4 or 5 years after I joined, we were into gender balance in the recruitment, and it has continued for the last 30 years like that. And of course, one of my friends became our first woman secretary of the department, Frances Adamson. She's just stepped down from the role and been replaced by another woman, I should say. So, you know, in my own period, my first boss was a woman. It was sort of unusual. There was a woman director in the department at the time. She later went on to be ambassador to the United Nations. So now I think really the sky's the limit. It's very balanced. Increasingly, I find, including here in The Hague, that I will be going to meetings of ambassadors where I'm the only man there. So there are changes there. But it's important, and it's important to have balance. And I think the great thing about your generation is you hardly see it as an issue anymore. I mean, you're conscious of it as an issue, but you know, you realize that this is now normal, and it's going to continue to be normal.
Thank you so much for remembering us about your friendship since early days. I think actually that was our last question, and I think we should move on to opening the floor to your questions. So everyone, whenever you would like to ask a question, please introduce yourself. Also online, please put your questions in the chat and we'll address those as well. So anyone?
Yeah, we have some microphones going around. So for the lady in the white jumper.
Actually, before that goes there, I'd like to steal the opportunity to ask a question myself.
There's a man jumping in before the woman. Oh, brave man.
Oh, no.
It is the privilege of the president, I think. Yes.
That wasn't my idea. Apologies. No, so you came to mention that you've been an international lawyer. You are an international lawyer, and you know this fascination of yours with international law. What has kept you that driven still now? What is, you know, you explained to us that you were, you know, you kind of went away from it and then you came back to it. But what was that nagging thought in your mind which always brought you back to international law and, you know, being in and around it?
Look, that's a fantastic question. I mean, when I first studied international law, I found it really, you know, exciting because it was real. In fact, I was having this conversation with Hilary Charlesworth just the other day, and it was the same sort of thing, that the rest of law, you know, was fine, but it was a bit dull. But when you got to international law, it was about what was happening in the real world in geopolitics, and it was a way of managing that. It was a way, and you can go back to Grotius on this actually, it's a way of bringing peace and order in the international chaos. I mean, because the nature of international society is to be chaotic, and the nature, it seems, of humanity in many ways is conflict. particularly when resources are scarce. And resources have been scarce throughout history, because it is only by developing our resources that, we now find, Malthus told us, we would destroy the world with a population of about 1 billion, and here we are at 8 billion, and we've found other ways to do it. But what law does is bring order into the international system, and it's about also bringing different cultural values together around agreed principles. And that itself is very exciting. I mean, there are elements to international law which are discussions about philosophy, about religion, and so forth, because you have to bring these together in a way that works. And of course, that's where then something like the International Court of Justice, with its rulings, its jurisprudence, is so important. And then when you are involved with something like the International Criminal Court, it is a way of addressing impunity. People, I've been in these situations and met with people in Sierra Leone or the DRC who absolutely believe nothing can touch them because they control their countries, their systems around them, and to have an international law that can one day catch up with them really matters. It even mattered to President Mugabe and was a restraining influence on him, I know from interaction. I mean, he thought the International Criminal Court was a terrible thing, and Zimbabwe was never going to sign up to it. But the very fact it was there was a restraint at the end of the day, because of this fear. And unfortunately, dictators rule by fear, so they also need to have some fear. And that legacy of Nuremberg has been very important through that. But international law is also much more positive, as we're talking about with climate change. It is a way of getting to a point where we can agree on the development of resources in a much more balanced way, instead of, in a sense, the rule of the jungle, where just the most powerful can control resources. So I think that's one of the reasons, and why I've always, through everything else I've been doing on bilateral diplomacy, I've always felt the pull back to the importance of international law. It is not what we say airy-fairy, it is real, and it makes a difference. Now,
thank you.
Take it from you.
Your Excellency, thank you so much for this very insightful conversation. My name is Lily. I am an Irish student here in The Hague, and aside from being Alta-Mash's subordinate, it seems, I would like to ask you a question actually a little bit more personal than international relations. So how do you manage situations when your personal values clash with those of your country, which you must obviously defend on an international scale, and how far do you go before your work becomes dishonest in a way?
Well, that's a very good question, because it was a question I was asked now well over 35 years ago at my recruitment. And then I was quite intimidated by that question, because, but my answer to it was, I do not believe that the country I would serve would ever ask me to do something that was against my values. And I can say with nearly 40 years of service, that has been my experience. And you might say, oh, no, that can't be true. And I think this is where I'm very lucky to have served a country like Australia, where there is a strong commitment to these democratic values and what we'd like to call a fair go in our national psyche as well as our international relations. And I absolutely can say I have never been put in that position. I have been, however, put into a position, and I won't be too specific about these positions because it has happened several times, where ministers have wanted to pursue a course of action, or a prime minister, with which I disagreed because it would have breached international obligations. And in each case, I have got my way. And why? And this is what being a good diplomat's about. Because you need to be persuasive. And you need to be able to win the argument on the basis partly of values, but partly also interests, because at the base of all international work is indeed serving your country's interests. And if you can make it clear to those, you're essentially a decision maker yourself, but if you have a minister or prime minister, they in a way are an ultimate decision maker. It's also very important to set up systems in democratic systems which also dissipate the power. And I'll give you a very good example, one which will mean a lot to you because you've mentioned Hillary Charlesworth's election. Hillary Charlesworth was not nominated by the Australian government. She was nominated by the Australian National Group, which consists of currently of the Chief Justice. She used to be on this group, the Chief Justice, a representative of the government, and an academic. And they consulted with me as to who would be the most appropriate people to put forward, and we discussed who would be the person who'd be nominated by Australia. Now, they had to advise the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister and the Attorney General. But it was not for the Prime Minister to nominate Hillary Charlesworth to run for the International Court of Justice. He could, the Foreign Minister could decide what resources we would put into it, whether we would support it. And in fact, she wasn't only nominated by Australia as national group, but in the end by 12 other national groups. Now, there is a very good system. And, it's a system because it means not one person has the power, and it's not the Prime Minister at the end of the day that necessarily calls the shots. Now, not all systems are like that, but democratic systems are. And international democratic systems are like that too. The Secretary General of the United Nations is not a powerful dictator. He has to bring countries together. One of the great achievements we made, I believe, in negotiating the Chemical Weapons Convention is we avoided a veto. As a result of that, Russia cannot veto our decisions at the OPCW. And as a result of that, we have been able to take action on use of chemical weapons in Syria and to pass resolutions which Russia has, and of course Syria, vehemently objected to, but cannot veto. And one of Russia's complaints is this is a matter that should be handled in the Security Council. We say no, it was a mistake to have a veto power. Now, you can argue the whole story of the veto power or not, but in a sense, it's really important as we build a more democratic international order to ensure that power is not in the hands of just one or two people. And as a diplomat, it's important to be conscious of that and to be conscious of the power you have to persuade. And that can be a very powerful power if properly used, and not to be intimidated. And we talk in Australia about frank and fearless advice, and I've always been a great believer in frank and fearless advice. And I remember once when I was working for our Minister of Foreign Affairs, who will remain nameless, but probably someone you haven't heard of, but doesn't matter. And he went into Parliament, and I was arguing with another more senior officer about how Parliament would perceive how he characterised a letter. It was over an issue, and he wanted to say that not one minister had written to him from Asia about a program, an aid program, that we were getting rid of. And I said, well, the Vice Minister of China has written about this matter. And the more senior person to me, I wasn't very senior in those days, said, yeah, but a Vice Minister is only an official. And our Foreign Minister said, see, that's right, he's only an official. I said, yes, but I think the Parliament will think if you use the title Vice Minister, that it might be a minister. So I'd be very careful about this. Anyway, the minister of the day went into Parliament and said, not one minister has written to me about this. The next day, leaked in the press, letter from the Vice Minister of China. The minister has misled Parliament, which is the worst thing you can do in our system. You know it here. It's even worse in the Netherlands, I have to say. Your Parliament is unbelievable. And then the poor minister, who I work with closely and like a lot to this day, is a friend. The Prime Minister was furious, and he said he's going to be censured, but could lose his job. thankfully he survived his job. He went on to serve a long time as a minister and did very well. But after that, you know, I have to say my credibility in providing advice went up as well. So you build a reputation for yourself as well in doing that. So it's a complex answer to what can be a very simple question. Now, I'm not saying that there may be people who are put in that position. And you do have one thing you can do. You can resign. I've never been put in that position, but I have had colleagues in other countries who have been put in that position. And you have to debate with yourself then. Everyone has to make a self-choice, whether you resign, which you can do and stand apart from it, or whether you feel that there's more value to stay there and carry out the instruction, and that you may be more persuasive over the longer term and be able to play a greater role. It's a difficult choice to make, and I would not criticize anyone for making either of those choices. But I'm pleased to say I can, with nearly 40 years service, still, you know, 6 or 7 months to go, well, till, you know, later next year, 9 months, I think, to go officially before I finish up here and then do something different. But I haven't actually ever been put in that position where I've had to do something against my conscience. And I hope I wouldn't.
Thank you so much. Anyone else? Oh, yeah.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you for taking your time and being here today. It's a great honor to have you here. So as a student who is interested in pursuing a field in diplomacy sometime in the future, I was just wondering if you have any tips or tricks or any skills that you recommend developing on, or anything that you could give other students who are also interested in pursuing this diplomatic career.
You're sort of asking for tips that make you more competitive to be a diplomat and get chosen? Is that what you're saying?
And just anything from your personal experience that you think that has benefited you in your career currently, or in your previous career as a diplomat, I mean, specifically.
Sorry. What I don't quite understand yet is, are you asking about tips from my own career or tips about becoming a diplomat?
No, from your personal experience, like just anything that you could...
That I've done as a diplomat that would be a good tip if you were in that sort of role?
Yeah, as a student who is interested in pursuing this career in this field.
It's a tricky question. I'm not quite sure how best to answer that. I mean, I think you need to have a very clear sense of your vocation, of what you're there for, of your country's interests, national interests, but in a broader international perspective. I think you have to be really quite sensitive to other cultures and other people's way of thinking about things, because that's where you become very valuable, particularly to your own political leadership, about explaining things. I mean, even here in the Netherlands, you know, this system of coalition politics is very hard to be understood by Australia. In fact, I got a message today from our Prime Minister's office saying, can I now send a text to Prime Minister Rutte to congratulate him on putting the coalition together? I think we can pretty much say that, yes, but he cannot believe that you can go for nearly a year without having formed a government, because in Australia you win the election and the next day you get up and you form the government as Prime Minister. And he's been wanting to send that congratulatory message. And I said, I think a text is all right now, but the letter might still have to wait until the Prime Minister is actually sworn in. So, I mean, you know, so even between countries as similar as Australia and the Netherlands, it can be quite different. So, you know, one of my tips would be and you probably pick it up here as you interact with one another. It's an invaluable training ground. That's just how to navigate cultural difference, and therefore to be able to assist in understanding down the track and making deals. And one thing I'll say about law in that regard, it's something we have in common. You study the same law. You can come from a civil law tradition and you can come from a common law tradition, but international law is written down in treaties, in the United Nations Charter. I have often pointed out to countries where there have been issues over human rights, you have signed up to the same declaration. It's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's not the European Declaration of Human Rights. And so that universality of the agreed international law is quite important in that too. But I'm not fully sure that answers your question, but I suspect your question is one that could be quite a long question. So maybe that will do for now.
I think we have time for one more question. So, where exactly?
The front row's been doing very well. Perhaps someone in the back row should get a chance.
Okay.
At first, I would like to thank Your Excellency that you came today, and we all had a great opportunity to meet you and to know more about Australia and its relations with other states. And going back to Australia's international relations, you mentioned some very relevant partners that Australia is cooperating with, for example, European Union states. However, maybe there are some states that could be great partners, maybe in your opinion, with Australia. And however, currently Australia is undergoing some hardships with these countries. Are there some states like this?
Oh, okay. Well, you could talk about France just at the moment if you want to. We can pick on Russia and China, but let's talk about France because we've had a bit of a problem with France. Now, I will admit that the AUKUS decision, which was one that was made for our strategic reasons, the shift from conventional to nuclear submarines, which will be a very complex one to work through, caused a great deal of consternation in France, where we had a major deal over their submarines. Now, France is a country where, we are close partners most of the time. And we will remain close partners. I'm pleased to say at both the OPCW and ICC sessions, we worked very closely with France, and the French ambassador here is a very good colleague of mine. However, we did, and I also do not believe that the way in which this announcement was handled was the best it could have been, far from it. And I think President Biden has made comments about that too. We have to do a little bit of work now on the diplomatic side to engage France more positively. But France is so important to us in the Indo-Pacific. Just this last weekend, there's been an independence referendum in New Caledonia, and New Caledonia is staying with France, and we value France as a stabilizing factor in the Indo-Pacific. We cooperate closely. In fact, I was reading a cable today about what we call FRANZ, the France, Australia, New Zealand Cooperation Group, which particularly has done a lot of work in disasters in the Indo-Pacific, where we have the resources to help many of those smaller island countries, and we need to work together. France is a really important ally. We won't get our EU FTA, free trade agreement, without the support of France. We know that, so it might be delayed for a little while we work this through. There will be other times when, this particular deal may have fallen apart and we may be now taking British kit or, US kit for our defense purposes, but there will be other deals that we will deal with France. I mean, it's such a long-term relationship, but I just mention it because it's perhaps an example of where over certain issues, friends will fall out. And I think France has a right to feel upset about it, and they've lost a big contract. We can say, and we do say, well, we had reached what we call a contractual gate, and we decided not to go through that gate because it wasn't in our interest to do so. And, it's like, I always could say it's a bit like when you're buying a car, and you may have said, I'll put down a deposit on the car, and on such and such a date, I will decide whether to buy the car. And then if on that date you say, well, actually, no, I'm not going to buy that car, you've lost your deposit. We've certainly lost a fair bit of money over this deal ourselves, but that person doesn't sell the car to you. So in that sort of normal way, but you remain friends because you have big interests at stake. So I'll use the France example because I know it's on people's minds a bit, and it's an example of, having differences. Differences with Russia and China perhaps are much more fundamental because there are values at stake. And France and ourselves have pretty much the same values. And for there, I think there will need to be some changes longer term. And frankly, I believe in Russia there will be changes longer term. I've gone to Russia several times in my career to have discussions with the Russians. In fact, I went to have discussions with them only 4 years or so ago when I was still heading up Middle East matters, because Russia is so important in the Middle East. Russia is a European country. It's a European country with a big footprint over in the Indo-Pacific. The desire of young Russians for the sort of lifestyle you have in the European Union is the same as I once saw in Yugoslavia or in Bulgaria or wherever. I mean, and we see the changes there. So I think in a way that, it's had quite a different history. That may be a transition that longer term post-Putin will be easier to achieve. And we almost got there at the end of the Cold War, but things went in an unfortunate direction. And I really hope we don't come to, real conflict in the Ukraine again, because that would really not help. So every effort must be made to stop that. With China, there's a much more fundamental issue at stake, and we may have to adjust also to China's culture. But you only have to see the way in which China has engaged economically with the world. I mean, I think the thing that all countries need to know is that you cannot dominate the world. Various countries, even of our own best friends now, have had to learn that lesson. And I will give Germany as an example. My ancestors left Germany back in the 1880s because of the unification of Germany, because they saw real problems. They were, military families from the princely states of Baden and Hesse-Darmstadt, and to this day we still remain friends, and we're distant relatives of the Grand Duke of Baden, the Markgraf of Baden. But, they could see that there would be problems with the way this country, which they loved and served, was coming together. And they decided, I have two German great-grandfathers, they decided as young men to travel to Australia. Obviously, those states had very close relations with Britain, so it wasn't so difficult to do. And in both world wars, my family fought against Germany, even though their name was German. Nowadays, when you look back on the First World War and on the Second World War and Nazi Germany, you find this unbelievable. Just as it was, unbelievable to most Germans in the 1900s, in the 1800s, when Germany was seen as the epitome of civilization, and is indeed one of the most refined countries and advanced countries in the world, and it's back in that place. So I think it's useful to always, and this is where law works with history. It's also very useful to look back on our own history. In more recent years, I've had to face the issue of human rights, and more particularly gay rights and gender rights in African countries. And I always do it because we can get very upset about some of their laws, many of which I must say they inherited from European countries. And it takes time for that sort of change. But I always say to myself, but it's only 40 or 50 years ago that many of these sorts of practice were illegal in our countries. Homosexuality was illegal. So when you approach the world and you approach change and you approach some of the challenges, you should approach it with humility, in my view, because we've all been there before. And rather than preach at countries, we should approach them with understanding And then with an understanding too that change is inevitable, as we've experienced in our own societies. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Your Excellency. Thank you for your insightful answers there to our questions, and thank you to those in attendance who gave these questions. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, we are going to have to look towards wrapping up. It's a deep shame. But just quickly, is there any final thoughts or words you would like to give to our audience?
Well, no, I've spoken far too much already, but thank you very much. It's been very enjoyable. I hope I haven't, people often think diplomats will say nothing. We will be very diplomatic, but I hope, in times, I know in the Netherlands people like to be frank, and it's so much easier to have that sort of exchange. But one message I would leave is look to the future with optimism. It's so easy, particularly in these days of COVID, to really worry about the future and to think, it's all going to be very hard and there's not much of a future. I have, through my life, faced many, many experiences, but I have found diplomacy is a terrific career. So those of you who are going to be diplomats, I encourage you in that career. There'll always be a job for diplomats. There's always a need for those who are the peacemakers. International law is a fantastic guide in diplomacy, so I encourage everyone to keep studying international law, learn from it, and there are many places other than working for your own national government, increasingly even in companies. And finally, I'd say face the future with optimism and be an agent for positive change, and you will live in a better world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. First of all, I'd like to thank you for being here, gracing us with your presence, the conscientiousness with which you work for your country, the hard work that you put in, and the desire for international law, as you so spoke today, is very conspicuous. And I am sure I speak for everybody when I say this. Your advice resonated with all of us here today. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure.
Second of all, a big and massive thanks to our moderators today who did a wonderful job. It was our first in-person event, a diplomacy day today of this academic year in the aula, and they did a great job, so thank you so very much for that. Thirdly, thank you to our Vice President, Sophia, who managed to pull this off on her shoulders to organize everything, and from top to bottom, thank you so very much, Sophia. Fourthly, thank you so very much to our program, particularly Madam Director, Ms. Moore, for being here, for helping us all out throughout, from the beginning to the end, helping us organize this. Without you and without the program, this wouldn't have been possible. Yes. And last, but definitely not the least, thank you so very much to our technical advisor today, Vincent. Without you, who, by the way, had to reschedule his appointment on a very short notice to make this possible. Thank you so very much. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to invite Ms. Moore over to the floor. So as you rightly mentioned in the beginning, a good ambassador always tries to represent his organization and the university. So that is what we are trying to do here. So we have this little ILSA tote bag, which of course represents our organization. And secondly, we have a gift from the Peace Palace, which again draws back to the fascination of international law. So it is always to serve as a remembrance to you that there is this international law which binds everybody, all of us together, and it'll always be like that. So thank you so much. Also, sir, with your permission, if we can have like a 1.5 meter distance picture, if that's okay with you, if we can all stand here. And I completely forgot. Apologies. Thank you so very much to all our audience online and in person who took the time at this hour to come here and intently listen to His Excellency. Thank you so much. India.
You have? Yes, which part?
From the eastern region called Odisha. It's near Bangladesh.
Yes.
So it borders Bangladesh. But yeah, so